Well, thank you very much to the organizers for inviting me to this meeting. I'm impressed by the level of attendance and the audience of this meeting, especially considering the current situation, where I could expect that a lot of other things are on the mind of people, but maybe precisely because of the current situation, the importance of this meeting in delineating new ways to tackle healthcare and improve healthcare delivery is even more important. I also would like to say on a personal basis that I really hope that our leaders will, during the course of this week, find a constructive solutions that will protect the future of the people in Greece and at the same time will protect the ideals of the European project. Having said that, I would like to start my presentation.
Forward.
Oh, it doesn't seem to work, but that's okay. I'll use the. Okay, it was off. What I would like to address in this presentation is the experience we've had with managed entry agreements as an industry over the last 10 years, and really address some key points that I see from experience, which may be hopefully helpful for deciding how you would want to use managed entry agreements in Greece moving forward. We've had about 10 years experience of managed entry agreement. They were initially developed when we were faced with very specific situations that the existing pricing reimbursement system, the HTS system, hadn't foreseen and were leading to dead ends. And in order to find a positive listing, we started crafting these agreements. The first one that we did were around Lucentis, a product for wet age macular degeneration, where the trials were done on a monthly basis. The approval at the European agency was on the basis of a simulation of doses on the basis of treatment as needed. So there were a lot of uncertainties as to how many vials or treatment would be needed, which was driving cost effectiveness. And with coming with capitation schemes that ensured that the healthcare systems wouldn't have to pay more than what was predicted from the simulations, we would protect cost effectiveness. Now, through this learning phase, we also hit a lot of practical teething problem in terms of implementation and what is required to implement those agreements. But consistent efforts were really required for effective and value generation agreements. Then came the financial crisis in 2009 with budget straps countries, with currency fluctuations in the context of external reference pricing, which also led to an increased use of these financial agreements to address these tensions as well. Nevertheless, over the last 10 years, the experience has shown that using these agreements has been beneficial to patients. In our own counts, we did a survey where we could show that for high-value product, I'm not counting the agreements also for mass market product, we could actually provide access for Novartis product to about 200,000 patients in a given year, which wouldn't have been possible with these agreements. So we must never forget that one of the key benefits of these agreements is to provide access. But what is the role of these agreements moving forward is really what I would like to address now. In my view, there are two fundamental divides that we have to be aware of, which will continue to argue for a practical use of these agreements. The first one is on the development side. Through the International Harmonization Conference on the regulatory side, you've got major agencies that have harmonized their requirements and which have led manufacturers to have global development programs that cater for the needs of the FDA, for the EMA, and somehow the PMDA for Japan, and perhaps in the future for the Chinese FDA. Now, those are very efficient programs, but targeted for the needs of a few agencies. At the same time, you've got an explosion of requirements from payers, whether national payers introducing new HTA requirements, or regional payers that are appearing on the scene, such as Italy and Spain, or even the need of local payers. Think of the commissioning groups in the UK, for example. All have different perspectives. Are these global clinical trial programs adapted to the needs of these particular payers? Not necessarily. The other divide that we need to address is the pricing divide. When you introduce a new HTA system, you have your own value, the societal value that should drive the methodologies, and each different countries will have different economically justifiable price, leading to differential pricing if you follow those different methodologies. At the same time, the external reference pricing is pushing for a single price more and more, increasingly with a number of countries included in baskets. Also, the algorithm picking the lowest price leads to harmonization and convergence of prices. Now, if we can't resolve those two divides, we may actually get to a straight no in terms of getting listing of products. Now, the HTA system should be adapted to actually have either a qualified yes. This is what you see with NICE, with restrictions, sometimes applied to the appraisal decision, but also a qualified yes that are supported by managed entry agreements. So in my view, the managed entry agreements will continuously be needed, especially also when you see that there are recent moves towards adaptive licensing on the one hand, but also increasing requirement for evidence on the other. The point of this slide is to really drive one message that is important, which is there's a lot of effort to classify managed entry agreements, looking at their technical aspects. I would argue that the more important classification is really the situations that you need to resolve to make sure that you're providing access in an efficient, to a medicines for an efficient use of that medicine within the budget. And the key questions are really about what is the strength of evidence that is brought by the clinical trials, what is the generalization of that clinical trial program to the real life evidence, which is increasingly being questioned, what is the value for money and what assumptions are going into those cost effectiveness models that we still have uncertainty about, and then finally, even though we may agree on the value of the drug, there may be situations where affordability is a real issue, and how do we address those? If we ask that question as to what is, in a specific situations, the key elements across those four pillars that we need to address to provide access, this will drive the choice of the type of agreements that you should be choosing. In other words, there is no single agreement type that should be favored, because in all instances, going from one drug and one situation to the other, you will hit different types of problems to be resolved. So if we focus on the discussion as to what type of agreement would provide what type of financial return, the question would be, why don't we use the most simplistic type of financial agreements that are fixed discounts? Why would we need the more complex agreement? That's why if you ignore the situations, you will be drawn towards the simpler agreement with fixed discounts, which may be still necessary, or a price volume agreement that would be necessary to address affordability or maintaining a control over budget. But what you do is you may lose the value of the information that you would get by trying to achieve some of the more complex agreement, because as you go towards the more complex agreement, the risk is higher, but also the need of information is higher. However, there is value in information, and I will come back on that. So what are the key elements for a successful managed entry agreement in our views? And presently, there were a number of elements that are all very important. Here, it's more a pragmatic view of those that we have seen creating hurdles to managing an agreement. So again, clear identification of the hurdle is key, so that we can make a positive funding recommendation that otherwise could not be resolved. The expectations between the manufacturer and the expectations on the side of the public system is key to make transparent and that we have shared expectation, both on the financial expectations of an agreement, but also expectations on the evidence that is really required. In other words, flexible choice of managed entry agreement model will provide a solution to address the interest of all parties that will have been made transparent through that discussion in order to provide patient access. Data collection is indeed proportionate to the level of uncertainty, and some of the outcomes-based agreement that include financial consequences should include the description of the financial consequences up front. One of the hurdles to agreeing on an outcomes-based agreement is what happens if the drug doesn't deliver as we expected. It's usually very difficult to make the step to withdraw a product for the market. And if you haven't agreed on the consequences up front, you could face very difficult situations. Other than that, if you do agree on the consequences, it is actually feasible. And then the confidentiality of managed entry agreement has already been stated, is absolutely important in the context of external reference pricing. Now, one objection to managed entry agreements, especially the more complex managed entry agreements, has been on the burden of collecting the data. Now, it's true in a certain way, but on the other hand, and you know, you've heard about the importance of collecting data, and I'm really encouraged by the way Greece has moved on to collect data to actually measure what is going in the system. This is a trend that is going on anyway, managed entry agreement or not. Healthcare data is absolutely critical, initially for safety and disease surveillance, but beyond that, for clinical decision-making, for efficient healthcare delivery, facilitating research, and in the future, linking genomics and clinical data. Think of this initiative of precision medicine in the US, where they're going to collect information for 1 million patients, linking genomic data with outcomes data. There is an exponential growth of data being collected. The issue is not the data, is how you're going to turn data into useful information, the analysis of the data. But that's where the value of the data is. So the implication for managed entry agreements is that we should leverage what is already existing and leverage claims database, leveraging the electronic health record databases, or leveraging the existing registries that have been put in place according to priorities of the healthcare system. In only specific cases will we consider collecting even more data for the specific need of a managed entry agreement. But in any case, you need to involve all the relevant stakeholders so that there is indeed an agreement of why are we collecting more data, for what purpose and what value. But it seems strange to me that we would say actually collecting evidence for the purpose of the managed entry agreement is not possible, while there is this huge trend and acceptance that the value of information for healthcare delivery efficiency is actually required. Just to give you an example of this is a practical example in France when we introduced Xolair, which is a treatment, so omalizumab, which is a treatment for severe asthma. There was a high number in the clinical trials of non-response. And the French authorities were questioning whether in real life the non-response wouldn't be lower than what we'd seen in the clinical trials, given the inclusion criteria and so on. So we committed to do an observational study, which was actually a disease observational study. The physicians didn't know that it was to study the efficacy of Xolair in real life. They were monitoring all severe patients, and the result actually confirmed the results of the clinical trials. As a result, on the pricing side, the French authorities decided not to touch the price, but up front we had agreed that depending on the result, the price could be moved downwards if we would not reproduce the results. But think about the value of this information and the publication that actually gives some sense as to whether in clinical trial, in real life, the product is actually behaving like in clinical trials. There is another discussion is around payment for performance or paying for outcomes, which is conceptually very interesting, but again, is it worth collecting the data to go into that type of agreement? Now, what is happening is we have had a few risk-sharing models, and we will continue to have a few risk-sharing models where the performance of the drug is evaluated against baseline performance in real setting, where the price could be modulated according to drug performance in real life, and where value of information will be gained because we're monitoring the outcomes around the pharmacological treatment. And this is actually an improvement versus a situation where we would say we don't believe the outcome, we take the most conservative assumption, and therefore the price should be related to the most conservative assumption, and we should have a straight discount. This type of discussion may not always lead to a positive outcome of the discussion. But there is another element to these risk-sharing agreements, is that there is an opportunity cost of ignoring the systemic performance. And as now we are measuring more and more real-life evidence, if we only measure the outcomes and attribute these outcomes to the drug performance, we're also ignoring the potential impact of the system, the organization of the system on performance. Just let me tell you one example. We are going to come on the market with a new drug for heart failure, which is regarded as a breakthrough on the strength of the data. But what we see when we are looking at how systems perform on the management of heart failure is a wide variation of performance across countries in Europe on mortality rates 1 to 3, on readmission in hospital 1 to 4. Now, this is not just due to the different patient characteristics. This is also seen, by the way, between regions within those same countries. So what is explaining those differences of performance? Is it coordination of care? Is it protocol at discharge of patients that are actually then moved into the primary care sector? Is it referring these patients to cardiologists, office-based cardiologists that can monitor these patients and ensure that the treatment is adapted to the current condition of the patient? If we ignore all this, we may have risk-sharing agreement about the performance of the new drug, but we are missing a big opportunity to try to look at those key drivers of inefficiencies or inequalities of outcome, and what could we do about this? And this is potentially one of the biggest sources of efficiency that will allow us not to reduce resources, but to use resources to the best of its potential, especially under a future constrained environment with the trends like aging of the population that we all know of. So I believe that in the future, while these agreements will be more difficult to put in place, collecting real-world evidence will actually call for initiatives to improve treatment, not just with drugs, but also with other interventions, be it applications or e-health, to improve the efficiency of delivery of healthcare. So my takeaway message is really that MEAs have really proved to be flexible and instrumental in providing patient access to innovative medicines, that successful implementations really require strong alignment on the need for an MEA. The mechanism and the willingness for practical implementation will follow if we are agreeing on the need for a managed entry agreement. They can deliver value of information for reasonable evidence gap identified by the HTA process. MEAs are not a panacea. Don't try to resolve all issues with managed entry agreement. HTA system as a basis should provide most of the answers. It's only when there are uncertainties and issues that you should use MEAs on the one hand. If you stretch their use, especially for financial purposes, it could discredit the value of these MEAs for patient access. They should rather be leveraged to deliver better health outcomes through the systems, through partnerships, addressing the key levers of performance of the system as a whole. Also, one important thing is that generalization of MEAs, they cannot substitute for ongoing European level efforts to provide guidance on evidence requirements. Think of the early joint assessment or the early joint scientific advice between the EMA and some of the HTA agencies that are providing companies with advice on how to develop drugs. Also think of methodology for presenting and assessing the evidence. There is the Get Real initiative, which looks at pragmatic trials to get closer to effectiveness prior to launch. also possibly joint European assessment of relative efficacy of effectiveness as being in discussion now at the European level. So MEAs are a good thing. They provide patient access. Find your ways to actually use them wisely, but don't expect that MEAs will resolve everything. So I thank you for your attention.